Hello, health champions. Did you know that most people in the world have a problem with high blood sugar? So today I'm going to give you the top 10 foods to help you lower blood sugar. But more importantly, we need to understand what normal blood sugar is and if and when it ever gets too low. Also, despite all the attention given to blood sugar, it may not be the first marker you want to be concerned with. I'm going to list these foods in categories so we can talk about them and understand them a little better. First category is low carb, protein, and fat. So if we look at a graph, it's kind of flat. There's not much of anything there. The next category is low carb, high fat, but still low protein. So here we increase the fat. And what does that do? It gives us more fuel. It gives us replacement calories, but with very little impact on glucose or insulin. And the next category is low carb, high fat, and high protein, because high protein can increase insulin a little bit, but not so much. It's a good trade-off because it's also the most satiating, it's the most nutritious. If we can only eat a few types of food, this one is the most satisfying and the most likely to keep us alive long term. So what we're trying to do, as you notice, is the red, the carbohydrates. That's the only one that we keep low in all these categories. And why is that? Because carbohydrates is another form of glucose, and glucose turns into blood sugar. That's where we get those fast blood sugar spikes, and if we eat a lot of carbohydrates frequently, we're going to keep triggering insulin and maintain high insulin levels, get insulin resistance, and then that insulin resistance promotes higher blood sugar, and now we're kind of stuck in that loop. And make sure you stick around to the end, because after the 10 foods, I'll have a little bonus for you. Number 10 on the list is berries. And these are things like blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, and this thing here is pretty common in Sweden. It is called a red currant. And all of these are things you can have some. It's about 5% net carbs in them. And what you have to remember, it's not a bulk food. So the reason this is 10 out of 10 is it's not something you want to eat a lot of. It's something that you can eat as a treat if you want something sweet, you want something to kind of round off the day or the meal, then this is a good thing to eat instead of candy, instead of other fruits. Number 9 is leafy greens, and this is something that you can pretty much eat as much as you like. And the reason is they're very low carbs, 1 to 3% net carbs, but also because they're mostly water and fiber, it takes you a long time to chew through a substantial amount. It's very difficult to eat half a pound of leafy greens, so the carbs will never really amount to anything. The drawback, of course, is that because there's so little carbohydrate and so little calories in it, you can't really live off it. But it's very nice to have as a foundation to make salads. And also that's why there's more than one item on the list. We want to vary things and change them up a bit. Number 8 is non-starchy vegetables. And we're still in the category where these things have very little of anything in them. Broccoli, cauliflower, celery, Brussels sprouts, they're around 2 to 5% net carbs. But these are things you can eat a little bit more of. You can easily eat a half a pound or even a pound or more of these non-starchy vegetables. And if you add some butter or some olive oil, then they become quite satisfying as well. Even though there's so much focus on blood glucose because so many people have problems with it, I think it's just part of the picture. And what we have to understand is that it's a controlled variable. The body tries very hard to keep it within a range of about 65 to 99. And those are the outer ends of that range. Most of people are going to find themselves in a much more narrow range than that even. And I think there's too much focus on glucose because it only really changes, it only really ever gets outside of this range under extreme conditions or when the body is failing to control it. So instead, we want to look at insulin. So if we compare glucose and insulin here, we see the yellow would be glucose And year after year after year, it stays pretty much the same on average. After we become moderately insulin resistant, it starts slipping a few points, but it doesn't really get out of hand until we're full-blown type 2 diabetics. Whereas if we measure insulin, insulin is what the body is using to control it. So the harder the body has to work to control glucose, the higher our insulin goes. So while glucose stays about the same, we can see insulin increasing almost linear over the years. So if we were to measure it, we can see the progression much, much earlier. Some other things I like to keep an eye on are triglycerides and VLDL, because when the cells become insulin resistant, they're resisting glucose, but also triglycerides, because glucose turns into triglycerides. And VLDLs is a vehicle that delivers triglycerides. So as insulin and triglycerides and VLDL goes up, we can see how the problem is progressing, but we can also monitor these to see how the problem is reversing. But I also get a lot of questions from people who are told that type 2 diabetics can't do low carb and they can't fast because their blood sugar gets too low. So what is too low? Let's start understanding that. Here's an article I found in Helioendocrinology Diabetes, and they're saying, despite benefits, intermittent fasting increases risk for hypoglycemia in type 2 diabetes. So people start fasting, they start doing low carb, and then they see something like this and they stop for all the wrong reasons. So what are the benefits they're talking about? Well, they're focused on blood glucose, but what's really happening, the benefits from lowering carbohydrate and lowering frequency of meals doing fasting is you're allowing the body to return to homeostasis. The problem is you have overloaded the body. You've sent it the wrong messages with the wrong kind of food, triggering too much insulin too frequently, so your body is congested. And when you eat less carbs less frequently, you're allowing that congestion to reverse. And that does so much more than just glucose. It starts affecting everything in your body. So everything related to metabolic syndrome and inflammation starts getting better. So the benefit is your body is now returning to normal. But then people read articles like this, and they read, intermittent fasting increased hypoglycemia among patients with type 2 diabetes. And that's kind of where their understanding stops. And we really have to understand the next sentence here, which says, who were treated with hypoglycemic medications, right? Hypoglycemia and hypoglycemic medications. Let's figure out those words. The body has the ability to regulate things. It can turn things up, it can turn things down. Medications can't do that. Medications block. Their mechanism is to go in and interfere. And if they're designed to turn things up, then they will do that. If they decide to turn things down, they will do that. But they can't do one or the other. They will do one that they are designed for. So the body can be very precise in its regulation. A drug, a medication, can only go in with the precision of a sledgehammer and sort of flatten things. So if we have a situation of really, really high blood sugar, like in a type 2 diabetic, then we're taking medication, and this medication forces a balance. So it forces it down into a more normal range. However, when you reverse the process, when you allow your body to return to normal, now that same medication is still going to keep doing the same thing, and it's going to force an imbalance after you have already started to create a balance. It's the same thing with blood pressure medication. It can only force blood pressure down. And if your blood pressure is too high, that can be a good thing. But after you normalize your blood pressure, now that medication will push it too low. So when you are starting to make changes to return your body to normal, that can actually look like a short-term problem, like hypoglycemia, but it is the long-term solution. And the solution is to fix the actual problem and talk to your doctor about changing your medication, not to keep doing the wrong thing so that your medication stays the same. And here's actually a true story. A patient came to me. We were working in my clinic on reversing their metabolic syndrome. We gave them some good nutrients. We had them reduce carbohydrates. We had them on a diet plan. And then one day they came back and said that my medical doctor is concerned. I went for my annual checkup and he told me I had to add more carbohydrate back in my diet because he didn't want to change my medication. It was too complicated. And the problem here is that the medical doctors are smart people. They're intelligent, they're well trained, but they can be stuck in what's convenient. And in their model, it's all about treating the symptom. They don't expect anything to ever reverse or return to balance because that doesn't happen in their model. In their model, there's a symptom and you treat it with the medication and nothing ever gets better on its own. But if you understand the mechanisms, you can start turning these around and bring balance back. Next category is low carb, high fat, but still low protein. So the first source here is going to be healthy fats. And you can certainly eat the fats that are in the food itself, like avocados and meat and so forth. But if you add fat, you want it to be things like butter, ghee, extra virgin olive oil, and coconut oil. These are fats that are produced with very little heat, very little pressure, and no chemicals. So they're naturally made and they're shelf stable. And ghee is a version of butter because some people are so sensitive to dairy that even the trace amounts of protein in butter can cause a sensitivity reaction. But if you clean it up, you remove those proteins, now you get ghee, and a lot more people can tolerate that. I was talking to someone about ghee and they suggest I use this meme to help explain it a little bit better. So they say, this butter is delicious. Actually, it's ghee. And she says, thanks for clarifying. I don't get it. And when we eat these healthy fats, we're getting calories. They increase satiety if we put them on salads or non-starchy vegetables. They're quite filling, but they're insulin neutral. They're so close to zero that we can consider them neutral as far as insulin goes. But then a lot of people will add in that I thought the healthy fats were the omega-3s, things like flax oil and fish oil. And there's a lot of confusion here. So here's what we want to understand, that if we're replacing calories, if we're replacing carbohydrate calories, we want to replace it with a fat that is suitable for fuel. And that's a saturated or a monounsaturated fat. These other fats are very specialized. They're very high omega-3 fats. And they're not intended for fuel. They don't do very well. They oxidize very easily. They're very sensitive. We need them in very small amounts because they're signaling molecules and they're precursors for building materials in cell membranes, right? We're not supposed to burn them. We need a few grams every day for specific reasons. But if we want to get calories from fat, which we do, then we want the saturated and the monounsaturated fats. And just like we can make oil out of it, we can of course eat the olives straight up. I love olives. They have 3% net carbs, 11% fat, and 1% protein. And it's not something that you would eat as a whole meal, obviously, at least I wouldn't, but I think it's great as a snack or a condiment or putting some in a salad. Number 5 is avocado. Maybe, in my opinion, the most satisfying plant food that there is. It is 15% fat, so rich and creamy, and only 2% net carbs. And if ever somebody wants to argue about the value of avocado, all you have to say is, well, you can turn it into guacamole. What else do you need to know? But I want to share a couple more studies with you to help you understand blood glucose even better and to understand how incredibly capable the body is, so you don't get scared out of something for the wrong reasons. In this study, they had a guy who fasted, water fast, for 382 days. There are other people who have gone 6 months and 9 and 12 months, but this is apparently the world record. It was medically supervised, and it was published in Postgraduate Medical Journal in March 1973. So during these 382 days, he went from 456 to 180 pounds. A lot of people will tell you that fasting doesn't work long term. This lifestyle has temporary results. But the beauty of this is this guy, 5 years later, he is still maintaining his ideal weight. Now here's some numbers that will turn most people upside down. Blood glucose levels remained around 30 milligrams per deciliter from the 4th month and on. That's about 1/3 of what they would consider normal, and it's less than half of what they would consider hypoglycemic. And this he kept on for about 9 months. A few months into it, it was stable, and then it just kept going. Then they even went to say that values below 20 milligrams were occasionally seen. And then you might think, well, maybe he had hypoglycemia occasionally, that he was feeling bad. But what they said is, despite the hypoglycemia, patient remained symptom-free, felt well, and walked about normally, had a normal life during this time. And here's the takeaway. First of all, do not try this at home. This was very closely supervised. They measured his minerals, they measured all of his markers, and at a few times they supplemented a few minerals or a few vitamins, but not very much at all. However, don't do this on your own. Next, we want to understand how incredibly adaptable the body is. That we look at these numbers that seem like he would be half dead. Typically, anything under 40 starts having neurological symptoms and coma. And he was having a normal life with a blood sugar that sometimes dipped into the 20s or under 20. And the other thing is, when we're being told to eat 3 square meals with snacks, so that you keep your blood sugar up, so you keep your focus and energy up, that obviously has nothing to do with reality. Why would we need to top off our blood sugar every 2 hours if he could go 13 months without doing it? The body has ways of stabilizing and maintaining that blood sugar. It does not have to come from the outside. And the other thing we want to realize is that normal is going to change. Someone who eats 300 grams of carbs, even if they haven't developed any metabolic issue yet, their blood sugar is probably going to be close to 100. Whereas if you're insulin sensitive and you reduce your carbs, you'll probably be somewhere around 80, 85. But if you're fasting or going keto, then lower is going to be normal for you. Next category is low carb, high fat, but also high protein. So now we're getting into more nutrient dense, more calorically dense food. Nuts, macadamia nuts, pecans, and walnuts are my favorites because they're high fat and protein, but they're also low carbohydrates. Some other nuts will have moderate carbohydrates, and you can still have some of those, but you need to know which ones they are, especially if you're trying to be on a strict low carb diet. And even though nuts is not like a whole meal in itself, they're still very satisfying. So you could have a handful of nuts as a snack, and they could keep you for hours, and they maintain your glucose levels pretty stable, as opposed to many of the sugary snacks. And very similar to nuts are seeds, and my favorites are flax, chia, hemp, and pumpkin. These are typically higher in protein than nuts because nuts are usually more than 50% fat, and then these are also lower in fat and carbohydrates. This next study I want to share because there's so much confusion about the brain and glucose. We hear all the time that the brain can only run on glucose. 100% of the fuel for the brain is glucose. And that's not true. When people get a little bit educated on keto and fat adaptation, they understand that some of the fuel can come from ketones. But I want to show you just how incredible the body is at adapting. So in this study, in the first paragraph, they're stating the purpose. They wanted to find out if they could use keto adaptation and avoid brain dysfunction in these people, even if they went to the extreme of inducing acute hypoglycemia by giving people insulin who didn't need it. So as a baseline, on day 1, they injected these people and they found that 9 obese subjects manifested frank hypoglycemic reactions. And frank just means they were direct or substantial or blatant. And these were symptoms like sweating, anxiety, tachycardia, chest pain, rising blood pressure, and mental confusion. So these are signs of extreme stress. And they also measured some hormones, and they found that their stress hormones were through the roof. The catecholamines, those are adrenaline basically, and if you're secreting adrenaline, you know that also your cortisol levels are going to be quite high. But then they had these people go on a fast for 2 months, and then they did the experiment again, and they administered identical per kilogram doses of insulin, and they measured the blood and they were identical concentrations. But this time there was no insulin reaction. There were no significant rise in the stress hormones, and here's the mind-blowing thing, glucose concentrations were measured as low as 0.5 millimoles per liter, equal to 9 milligrams per deciliter. So normal blood sugar is like 90, we're in the 80s, and here they were at 9. Typically people lose consciousness around 30. Now here's just my little theory, that if normal blood sugar is around 90 and his glucose was 9, his glucose levels were 10% of a normal, so-called normal, and he was feeling fine, then to me, that means that he was probably getting 90% of his brain fuel from ketones. That's just my way of looking at that. I can't guarantee that number, but it does show you how amazing the body is, that at 9 milligrams, you can feel normal. So when would you want to stop a fast? When would you want to change something? Well, your body has these nice little clues called symptoms that if you're feeling great, you're probably doing fine. But if you're having any of these symptoms, if you have anxiety, tachycardia, chest pain, mental confusion, then it's probably time to eat a little more carbohydrates if you're on a keto diet, or if you're fasting, then probably break your fast and have something. Just use common sense. And number 2 on the list would be eggs and dairy. And my recommendation is that if you have the dairy, then don't do the low fat. Normally they tell you that you can't have dairy except low fat because they're mostly concerned with the saturated fat. My only concern really is if you have a sensitivity to any of the proteins. So you reduce the likelihood of that sensitivity by eating the things that are high in fat, then the percentage of protein goes way, way down. And in a low-carb, high-fat diet, it's the saturated fat, the fuel that you're looking for satiety and calorie replacement. My go-tos here would be heavy cream, sour cream, creme fraiche, which is basically sour cream made from heavy cream. Normal sour cream's around 15% fat, creme fraiche is more like 35%. And also different forms of cheese typically run around 30% fat. And very often eggs are referred to as the most complete food that we have, and there's a lot of good arguments for that as long as you don't throw away the yolk. The yolk is part of the package. If you throw away the yolk, you're losing 90% of the nutrition in the egg. So make sure you eat the whole egg, unless, and this is my only reservation for any of this, is if you have a known sensitivity. Dairy sensitivities and egg sensitivities are rather common, but if you do well with these, then they're probably some of the best foods you can have. And number 1 on my list would be meat, fish, poultry, organ meats, etc. And why is that? Because it's the most satiating. These are the most complete foods. A big part of lowering your blood glucose and reversing your metabolic syndrome is to eat less carbohydrates and fewer meals. And the best way to do that is to eat things that satisfy you, because then you will eat less and you go longer between meals. So if I was to only eat one food, if I could only eat one thing for 6 months, it certainly would not be lettuce. I mean, I love lettuce, I love nuts and seeds, but if I could pick one thing to eat, I would eat red meat. And it would be really boring, I think. It would be great to be able to vary it up, but what I'm trying to say is the food value, the completeness of that food is why this is on number one. And in recent years, the carnivore diet has been very, very popular. And this is where people eat not necessarily a single food, but they eat this single category. They only eat animal products, and they probably include some eggs as well. But the reason is if they are sensitive to all the other stuff, then this would be the ideal, the ultimate elimination diet. And if they stop having allergic reactions, they're going to get healthier. So for some people, that is a good idea, at least for a few months. But most of us are not that sensitive, and we're not forced to stick with a single product. We don't have that ultimatum of living on a single food. So the best thing to do is, I think, to eat some of this every day. You could have meat most days or every day, but then you mix it up with all of the other foods that we talked about for a good variety. And if you're trying to lower blood glucose, here's a little bonus for you. That acetic acid, which we have in vinegar, in apple cider vinegar, in pickled vegetables, if we use vinegar to pickle them, or anything sour pretty much, like sauerkraut, it has a number of different acids in it. It has primarily lactic acid, but there's also some acetic acid in there. And this acid has a signaling property to lower insulin resistance, to lower blood sugar, to lower A1C and triglycerides and all those different things. And it's not a solution in itself, but if you're doing all the other things you're supposed to, lowering carbs, getting some exercise, relaxing, etc., then this can be a very, very nice addition to that program. And also keep it simple. If you like apple cider vinegar and you want to make it part of your daily regimen, do that. But also keep it simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. If you have a salad and you put some vinegar on it, that still counts. If you like pickled vegetables, or you just like to add it to a sauce or a food or something, then all of that acetic acid is still going to contribute some of those benefits. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.